the lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It started on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday at Elmore Junior High. Gumball and Darwin walked through the familiar hallways, but something felt different. The usual chaos was replaced by an eerie silence that made their footsteps echo unnaturally. Miss Simeon's classroom was empty, yet they could hear her voice coming from inside the walls, reciting lessons to students who weren't there. The brothers exchanged worried glances as they noticed other classmates moving through the corridors like sleepwalkers. Penny floated past them without her usual cheerful greeting, her shell reflecting images that weren't really there. Banana Joe walked by, but his peel was turning an unnatural shade of brown, and his eyes had become hollow black voids. When they reached their classroom, they found their desks arranged in a perfect circle, something that had never happened before. The chalkboard displayed equations that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed. Darwin whispered that maybe they should leave, but when they turned around, the door had vanished, replaced by solid brick wall. The school's PA system crackled to life, but instead of Principal Brown's voice, they heard their own mother Nicole speaking in a monotone that chilled them to the bone. She was calling them home for dinner, but the words were all wrong, describing a meal that no living creature should ever consume. The announcement repeated endlessly, each repetition becoming more distorted and mechanical. As they searched for another way out, the hallways began to stretch impossibly long. Lockers opened and closed by themselves, revealing glimpses of alternate versions of their school where everything was slightly wrong. In one, they saw themselves sitting at desks, but their eyes were completely white, and they were writing the same word over and over again in notebooks that never seemed to fill up. The fluorescent lights above started flickering in patterns that almost resembled Morse code, spelling out messages that made no sense but filled them with inexplicable dread. Other students began appearing in doorways, but they stood perfectly still, watching Gumball and Darwin with expressions that were too wide, too knowing, too empty of the spark that made them who they were. Time seemed to move differently in this version of their school. They walked for what felt like hours, but the clocks on the walls all showed the same time, frozen at exactly 3:33. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step they took, and their breath began to form visible clouds in the increasingly cold air. Finally, they found themselves back in the main hallway where they had started. But now it was completely dark except for a single spotlight illuminating a figure standing at the far end. It looked like their father Richard, but he was standing upright with perfect posture, something he had never done in his entire life. When he turned to face them, his usual goofy smile had been replaced by an expression of absolute seriousness that was somehow more terrifying than any monster they had ever encountered. The figure that looked like Richard began walking toward them with measured, deliberate steps that echoed through the empty school. With each step, the walls around them began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of their house, but wrong in ways that made their hearts race. The living room where they had spent countless happy hours was now filled with furniture that faced the wrong directions. Family photos where everyone's faces had been replaced by blank spaces, and a television that showed only static but somehow seemed to be watching them back. As the Richard figure drew closer, they realized that this